how S21 or Semantics 21 has really been driving that AI from the ground up, introducing a completely new level of policing, not just here in the UK, but abroad, to make sure that our police forces are properly equipped and also can have tools that can meet the challenges that are rising up. Again, something we're going to talk about in terms of excessive amounts of media, the complexities behind it, and so much more. So, just jumping into our agenda. So what we're hoping to discuss today over the next hour is give an introduction to who we are as a company, as well as, of course, myself and Claude on the call, what the company stands for, why it was set up and when it was set up. And that really drives where we're going to go next, which is why we do what we do and what we actually do. So we're going to talk briefly about, or hopefully in a bit more depth, about the law enforcement challenges that are out there, everything from the mass amounts of media we talked about, the legalities behind it, and so much more. Then we're going to talk about the actual S21 AI-based solutions, which we call the Laser Eye products. Anyone that's been on our websites will see we've got Laser Eye X, our flagship product across the world. But really want to focus on how we've tried to meet the challenges that are out there for police forces, and the both the technical challenges from a perspective of a police officer on the ground, but also as researchers, what we know the challenges are out there, which we know are coming in the future, and we need to really kind of prepare our police forces for. We're going to really illustrate how those solutions have worked by use of the customer stories. And we've got three, we may go into the fourth customer story, which are actual live cases where we're going to explain a little bit about, of course, the names and the numbers are going to be purposely kept confidential, but how we've used our software, how police force have used our software to actually help find victims and tackle the burden that they've got. And then we're going to really wrap it up with the outstanding challenges, which really illustrate where we're going. So the challenges that still remain in the field, and really, they're not going to be solved by one company, and they're certainly not going to be solved in a short amount of time. These are long problems, which really not only this generation, but the next generation of researchers, developers, and people I'm sure listening in who have a passion for IT and technology, all of us can do something to help contribute and to chip away at that burden for. So that's the outstanding challenges. And of course, we'll then take Q&A, any questions coming in. We ask if you can keep the questions coming in through the chat windows. And of course, we've got Charlie and the team who will be reviewing those and hopefully asking those at the end. If there's anyone that's a bit shy, please do contact us direct. There are some contact details at the end. You're more than welcome to email myself and Claude or the team here, and we'll get back to you as well. So really an introduction to Semantics 21. So S21 was started 5 years ago, founded by myself, really with a singular aim. And where that aim came from was after working with Staffordshire Police, fantastic police force here in the Midlands, in 2009, I could see that the technology being used by forces across the UK was completely lacking in terms of there was not that clever AI in there that's going to speed up their job and that's going to take them from working in a completely manual method, we'd call it, and being able to semi-automate, if not automate, many of their workflows. And it was concerning for me. As someone that has worked, done my 4-year BCS degree honours in digital forensics, I was concerned that, what we were being taught hadn't always been applied to the field. And looking into the challenge of that and the fantastic people that work at Staffordshire Police and different forces I worked with, there was this massive gap, a gaping hole of not being able to purchase the right software or not having software that was specifically built for the task. And a lot of that really comes from police force, and we'll talk about the challenges there in terms of them being very closed and very what we call siloed. Police forces and various other organizations we work with don't like to tell people what their challenges are. They don't like to say where they're having difficulties. And I guess one of the main reasons for that is, as the public, we rely on these people to protect us. So if they had gaping holes in what they were doing, it can really knock user confidence and public confidence, and it's not their fault. So because of what I saw there, I really wanted to take the fantastic stuff I'd learned from the BCS and BSc more to the point and of course going into my PhD and all the fantastic research that my supervisor at the time, Professor Chibelushi, was exposing me to in terms of all this fantastic semantics intelligence, all this fantastic AI for pattern recognition, etc. And to try and make that available to the end user, not from really complex research, big systems, but deployable systems that S21 could put into the hands of any investigator with limited IT training, again, something we'll talk about, but could still maximize and get the use out of. And that's exactly where S21 came from. And the three pillars of the organization have been the same from day one and remain the same now. The first one is about processing cases and evidence faster, allowing our police forces to get through massive amounts of images and videos and being able to process them as quickly as possible, so we're not leaving people on bail or on parole who are potentially affected, but also on the flip side of that, innocent people that have potentially been arrested whose life are essentially on hold or destroyed while they wait for a police force to actually examine the media. I think that's really, really important. And then on top of that, so that's the first pillar. The second pillar is victim ID, and we'll talk about that more later on. It's not just about the images and videos someone contains and whether they're illegal or not. It's about understanding who's been depicted in there. We're not going to stop these horrific crimes of child sexual exploitation by stopping people possessing the media. We need to find the victims who are being affected by this. They need to get the help. We need to make sure we protect them. And it's something which we feel before S21 was something that hadn't been challenged enough and hadn't been tackled enough. And again, we're going to talk about what we do in that area. So that's the second pillar. And the third pillar, which we're very, very passionate about, is investigator welfare. We'll talk more about the stats shortly, but one of the things which is alarming for myself as a member of the public when I started working police forces is how much of this material there is. And we'll talk more about 70% plus of caseload workloads is in CSE. That's horrific by any standard. But when you think you have dedicated, amazing people having to work, the 9-to-5 job, looking at picture after picture after picture and video after video of this unbelievably horrific material, people don't reflect on that. We hear on the news X amount of people who got these images, etc. No one thinks of the poor investigators who are having to do this. They have lives, they have families themselves. This is really horrific. So the three pillars have always been to S21 and always will be, and we'll see that shortly. The processing cases as quickly as possible, but of course the accuracy and making sure you get the best quality, the investigator welfare, and then third and finally, but still as important, the investigator welfare, how we can protect those who are protecting us. Now, as part of that initiative, you'll see three logos behind us, below. We've got the We Protect Alliance, which is again a UK-based organization where we work with IWF, Internet Watch Foundation, and various others that we work alongside to try and make sure that investigators are finding images. We can share that data, not the images themselves, but the actual data that can help us find victims, but also can help We Protect and the IWF to take down websites that are sharing this content, which is really important. CADE, which is the UK initiative for Child Abuse Image Database, where essentially we linked all forces together to try and share that data, to try and say, hey, we've seen these images before, pre-label them, share the victim ID data, which again is really important. And the global initiative version of that, which is called Project Vic, which is that last logo on the right-hand side. And Project Vic really essentially are trying to allow forces, not just in a singular country, but multiple countries, to share that data together, link victims and link investigators to other investigators to help them expand on their case. So really important initiatives we're proud to be part of. Now we're really to introduce ourselves. So I'm the good-looking guy on the left-hand side in the photo. That's me, Dr. Liam Owens, CEO and founder. So really, that's how we started S21. I've got a first-class honours in digital forensics and a PhD in multimedia analytics and AI at Staffordshire University. Fantastic university, very proud to be a part of. I've worked with law enforcement for about 14 years now, and digital forensics in that time as well, and data recovery and all the different areas it was called before that. My thesis at Staffordshire University was the framework and decision-making technique for the automated categorization of paedophilic multimedia. The aim really was to, working alongside Staffordshire Police, create an AI which had never been seen before, to be able to look at images and videos and to determine the severity level of them, of whether they're legal, whether they're illegal, but also how illegal they are, because of the grading systems used by forces across the world. It was very successful, and we'll talk more about that later on. For now, I'm going to hand over to Claude.
Right, yes, good evening. It's very much a pleasure and honor to talk to you today. Just to start, just tell you a little bit about myself. Claude Chibelushi, and I've been working with Liam for the past, how long has it been, Liam?
Too long.
Don't say too long.
It's got to be coming up 10 years, hasn't it?
10 years, yes, yeah. So, but my history goes way beyond it. Been working in research around artificial intelligence applied to processing images, videos, as well as sounds from as far back about 30 years ago. And it all started for me when I just got my master's and was looking for a PhD topic. And at the time, we're talking around 1991. Not sure how old Liam was at the time, but
I was
he
three,
was definitely alive.
I was 3.
Yes, yeah. So at that time, one of the hot topics in AI was intelligent tutoring systems. In other words, you want to develop software that's going to be as clever as a teacher, tutor, lecturer. And obviously, there are loads of challenges surrounding that, as how do you actually capture the intelligence of a teacher? How do you capture the intelligence of the subject matter that you want to teach, and so on? When I looked at it, I thought, wow, it'll be great. Needless to say, intelligent tutoring systems didn't go that far. And one of the reasons was the particular approaches that people were looking at were essentially human engineered, so you go and get the relevant knowledge from an expert and try to encode it in a machine. Yeah. And obviously, depending on which expert you go to, you end up with either incomplete data, not quite, and so on. But the idea is you want to capture as much of that as possible. And then after that, of course, how do you actually deploy it in practice and so on? So the success rate of those was a bit limited. And again, so back from that, but for me, it was more or less the spark, about all these things that machines could potentially do. So I went on to do my PhD at University of Wales, Swansea, where at the time I was again interested in parallel systems, parallel computers, high speed, and so on. At the same time as well, I was interested in artificial intelligence. And at the time as well, early 1990, neural networks were seeing a resurgence among, the research communities. And of course, neural networks, you have so many processing units connected together and trying to do the job. And obviously that means that you need high computational power and so on. So for me, it sort of brought the two ends together, my interest and passion for AI together with the parallel computing side. And to make it slightly more challenging as well, we were the first to look at how we can combine images with sounds in order to try to automate the recognition of people. So we're talking automated speaker recognition. So we did some work, used neural networks for that, and then achieved some very good results, which again, I think were left. I think I left Swansea and then joined Staffordshire at the time and carried on my research. And over time, I sort of kept applying the AI to a number of areas. Of course, we talk in the biometrics, as in, the speaker recognition and so on. Healthcare was one other area that I was looking at. And then towards the end, I was also looking into smart vehicles, for highly automated driving, where the focus from our end, working with BMW, was to try to make those vehicles as safe as possible. Because after all, you get in there, the car takes control, but you want to make sure that, it behaves the way it's supposed to, particularly, in safety critical situations. And then working as well, looking into digital forensics, where again, I think it was a case of, the world is changing. The number of crimes is going up, and in particular, crimes against children is a serious issue that needs addressing, which is where Liam came. We discussed what he wanted to do, and definitely I've always been for applied research. And he again suggested we look into digital forensics for analyzing, grading child sexual abuse images. By grading, we mean when an investigator gets an image, they are supposed to decide how severe that image is, so that the sentencing category as well will go up or low depending on how severe that is. And obviously there's loads of images, so that process needed automation, and that was Liam's work, on which we worked together for a number of years. Liam finished and then joined industry. I stayed in the ivory tower. And in the meantime, of course, things were growing, and we're talking with Liam, doing some work in the background as well. And the company was growing, needed some more muscles. Eventually, I made the transition from university into industry. And we've been having fun since. So that's very quickly about me. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the legal challenges later. In the meantime, I'll hand you back to Liam, please.
Perfect. Thank you, Claude. So just before we actually dive into a bit more detail, so one thing we're really, really proud of at S21 is how we've been, recognized across the world. We are the first ever digital forensics company to be recognized by both the UK Prime Minister, which was Theresa May at the time, and Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, by being awarded the Queen's Award for Enterprise in the category field of innovation, where we were assessed as having a huge contribution towards research and development around the areas of policing and certainly around our works in CSE. So really welcomed by that. So fantastic. And of course, also here, local awards. We love our local awards as well, with Staffordshire Chambers, who recognised us early on for the works that we did there. So we're really proud of those, and we thank them still for all the support that they've given to us. So now we're going to jump into a little bit more of the meat of the situation, and we're going to start with the law enforcement challenges, which I'm going to pass you over to Claude on this one. Claude, are you okay with that?
All right, yeah. Yes, thanks. Yeah, I'm ready. Thanks a lot, Liam.
Thanks.
Right, yeah, next slide, please. Okay, I think just to set the stage, so we are talking about AI for digital forensics, yeah? And as I mentioned earlier on, we very much looking into not just blue sky research. We are for actually doing research which can be applied and used in the real world, which basically means that we need to solve actual challenges faced, in this particular case, by digital forensics investigators. And one of the biggest ones that they are facing is essentially to do with the workload. The workload is very heavy. This will keep coming back a number of times, but essentially, if you look at the first bullet point there, where essentially CSA, which is child sexual abuse, there are so many cases flying around to the point where, at the moment, the work that investigators do in police units, more or less across the world, is about 75% of their work. So we're talking about 3/4 is to do with investigating child sexual abuse images, which is quite big. Yeah. But then, when you actually look at how big some of the cases could be, in that 75%, the cases could go up to 10 terabytes. This is just one case, a particular individual or suspect, they seize the machine, image the machine, capture the data on there, essentially images, videos, and whatever else is there. Those cases, that material could go up into 10 terabytes of data. Yeah. And you can well imagine that, having investigators go through those. Another time, like Liam mentioned, that when one of the things that prompted him to get into digital forensics was when he worked at Staff's police, he realized that the technologies they were using was behind the technological advancements in computer science. Yeah, and essentially the way it works is you open the case up, and you can imagine with those 10 terabytes. It takes a long time to load if the system hasn't been designed carefully. We'll come back to that. Competitors, what used to happen those days, police investigators used to call it an end of day job. That is, you want to open a case, before you go home at the end of the day, open the case and let it start to load. Come back tomorrow morning, hopefully it would have finished loading, but in some cases, it'd probably go on for a day or two before you could actually do any work on that particular case. So we're just talking about loading the case. Once the case is loaded, the work now begins. Yeah. And the way it happens again is you got to open those images or videos, look at them. And I mentioned earlier on, you need to grade them, decide how severe either the image is or the video, either in full or some frames in them are as well. And that takes a lot of time. So a lot of time waiting for the data to load up and a lot of time to actually do the grunt work. Yeah. As a result of that, there is many cases that people have seized, they haven't been able to process them. And we reckon across the world, they are sitting on a backlog of about a year and a half worth, months, of data. So that's quite a lot. And you can imagine what's happening in the meantime. A case has been seized, there's a suspect, but the material hasn't been investigated. Therefore, there are issues as to whether that suspect can be kept in detention or they have to be released. Yeah. And obviously, if they get released, there is a high likelihood they may reoffend. Yeah. Very importantly as well, Liam mentioned the victims are very important. Yeah. As long as that case hasn't been solved, potentially the victims are still being abused and the abuse is going on. So there's a problem there. So one of the tasks that we set ourselves is to try to cut down on the backlogs, which means, if we talk in computer science, we want to automate things, but we want to automate them as much as possible. Yeah, we're not talking about 100% automation because on the one hand, we talk in digital forensics, the processing has got legally admissible. And at the moment, for legal admissibility, a human being has got to take responsibility for the investigation. It can't be left to the machine 100%. So the machine can come in as a virtual assistant. Yeah, so that's the backdrop. So we talk in huge cases, heavy workloads, massive backlogs, and we want to automate by assisting the investigator doing their work as fast as possible without having to wait a long time for the case to load up. Now, on the other side as well, we talk in human beings having to do this work, but unfortunately, due to public spending cuts, the numbers have been either been declining or they've stayed level, while at the same time, the crime rate and the size of cases has gone up. Yeah. Other issues as well are to do with the same case could be seen by different police units across the world, because remember, this is a worldwide crime. Yeah. Ideally, those cases should be shared so that when one police force gets a particular case, investigates it, that information, as well as intelligence about potential victims, potential suspects, and so on, needs to be shared with other police forces across the world. But there as well, there's issues. For example, yes, we're going to share. Liam mentioned the child abuse image database for the UK. He also mentioned Project Vic worldwide, but there's issues around how much does it cost? Like I mentioned, that 10 terabytes for just one case. So do we store all the images, all the investigation notes, as well as any other metadata that we happen to seize? So the cost very quickly ramps up. Who can access those databases? Yeah. And also, how do we make sure that we retain as much information as possible and it fits within the workflows of individuals? And then there's loads of questions as well on the legalities of it. What about privacy issues, security, and so many things? So it's really practical challenges that we have there. Yeah. Could I have the next slide, please, Liam? Yeah. So that was more starting point. We want to automate as highly as possible. But some of the issues that, of course, that we need to deal with is the fact that if we talk in digital forensics, the sort of images and videos that an investigator looks at is not typically the nice and crisp data that we tend to watch on Netflix or, on TV and so on. Often the images have been damaged. What do we mean by that? The person has been looking at a video or downloaded something, and may have deleted part of it or deleted all of it, but eventually when it's recovered, sometimes we only recover incomplete data. And when you try to play a video in a box standard video player, if that video is degraded, incomplete, sometimes it just kills off the player. Sometimes the player actually just tells you that, sorry, I can't process this, and so on. But for us, we know that that video contains potentially significant evidence for a case. Just to put things in context, I think, I'm not sure, Liam, I think it was about a year ago, 2 years ago, where there was an investigator processing a case, and again, sees the case, there's a video, wanted to play the video, played the first about minute of the video, and then the video stopped. Yeah. He could see that, there's nasty things being done to a child in that video. And unfortunately, he couldn't identify the child, neither could he identify the perpetrator. So he was at a loss. And then came to us, we discussed it, and we said, yes, we've got what we call the corrupt handler. With a corrupt handler, we use intelligent techniques to try to retrieve as much of the video as possible, and also to piece it together to make it as coherent as possible so we can play as much of it as we can. Sometimes we can't play it at all either because, it's just so badly corrupt that you can't. But in this particular case, and in many cases, we've been successful. In this particular case, the investigator, with the help of our corrupt handler, was able to go about 5 minutes into the video. And the good news was they were actually able to see the child, identify the child, and even pick up clues about the location where they could find that child. They went in and they rescued the child. Yeah. And of course, when we got that news for Liam and I, it really made our day, because that's what we do this work for. Yeah. So we've come up with technology which allows investigators to try to work with poor images, low quality data, and so on. We mentioned missing chunks there, but it could also be that, the image is distorted. By that we mean there could be some blurring, or it could be heavily pixelated, and so on. There as well, we've got some artificial intelligence techniques which allows us to try to either removing the blur as much as possible or increase the resolution as best as we can. Liam is going to quickly discuss those later. A very important issue that Liam mentioned earlier on, we're coming back to it, is again this business of someone is sitting, watching potentially damaging images to their mental health, because that material sometimes can be quite gruesome. We're talking essentially children being abused, and the person investigating those images is seeing and hearing stuff that none of us would hear in our normal day-to-day, but they do this day in, day out. And remember, in the previous slide, we said 75% of their cases are to do with child sexual abuse. It's really a massive problem. And therefore, again, by going down the automation route, we're trying to help reduce the exposure of investigators to traumatizing material. Liam mentioned victim identification, very important. Victims have got to be identified. And again, the problem here is investigators are so overwhelmed with cases to process. Potentially some of the tools that they are using are not adequate. Therefore, they do the urgent thing. And the urgent one is, in their eyes, is we label, categorize, take the case to court, the offender is sentenced, case closed. But remember, there's a victim in each and every image and every video that's been looked at. So victim identification has been so far the Cinderella of the child sexual abuse investigation area. And Semantics 21, we place it high on the agenda. We'll come back to it later on when we talk about the projects that we're doing. Next slide, please, Liam. Yes, yeah. This is just very quickly some statistics, just to show you how big the numbers are. I won't dwell so much on this. Just looking at pornography in general, 35% on the internet is, so we're talking 1/3 of the material. Mobile search is about 20% looking for pornographic contents. Yeah. And again, if we look at that content itself, about 88% of it depicts violence against women. Yeah. Some a bit old stats that we've thrown in there because we haven't been able to find some recent ones, but we're talking every day about 500,000 searches for just teen porn. Yeah, so that's quite a lot. Virtual reality, again, we're talking technology being used for the wrong ends. The business is around $1 billion, and this was 2015. We guess, we would have gone at least double that by now. Yeah. Traffic again from websites and so on, especially now with quarantine and so on. We're talking about, again, 25% or roughly a quarter of the traffic is again going to pornographic websites. So it is a big problem. And that again reflects on why police are facing the challenge of spending roughly about 3/4 of the work investigating this particular awful crime. Next, Liam, please. Yes. And again, just wrapping things up, you know, we mentioned the numbers there, but again, no one really knows what's happening, you know, so the numbers are quite fuzzy for a number of reasons. Some places they say we don't have that problem in our country. It's not our culture, you know, we don't know that and so on. But the reality is most likely not, you know, issues around regulations and so on are also there. We mentioned virtual reality earlier on, the business and so on, but just sex trafficking in general. Again, we're talking 99 billion, and this was just 2014. And you can imagine what the figures could be today. The Internet Watch Foundation, they are struggling day in, day out, removing websites that are reported as containing, again, they are CSE or CSA, CSE, child sexual exploitation, CSA, child sexual abuse. In 2019, we're talking 133,000 websites being taken down by just the Internet Watch Foundation on their own. NICMEC, 2018, we're talking 18.4 million websites suspected of containing child sexual exploitation images. The Canadians, 13.3 million of child sexual exploitation images, and then they were able to take down 4.6 million of those. Europol is sitting on 46 million. We're talking unique images and videos. You know, this is really massive. And then there's an estimated about 750,000 people looking for child sexually explicit material daily. So really talking high numbers, very fuzzy. Like all estimates, we guess the reality is probably way beyond what you've seen on the screen. Yeah. So that's just right to put things into context. Could I have the next slide, please, Liam? Yeah. So now we're going to look into the solutions now. Yeah. And here Liam is the one that's going to cover them. But just to remind you that, you know, we are Semantics 21, and our strapline is trusted evidence found faster. You saw earlier on, there's loads of cases that need processing, so speed is important. But not just speed on its own, the evidence found has got to be reliable. So Liam is going to go into the details of how our AI is helping law enforcement to essentially find trusted evidence faster. Over to you, Liam.
Thanks, Claude. So I think one thing I'm going to start with here before we jump into some of the AI and what we're doing here is something that's quite important. Now, so far, the majority of the words that we bashed around have been to child sexual exploitation. And that really was the bread and butter, the fundamentals of why we built S21. That was the biggest issue that I saw that really drove me to, you know, pull together a fantastic team with Claude to really combat and tackle that. And still, it's our primary goal. But S21s are also being used in various other crime types. So originally, we of course created a product and we sold the product into combating CSE. However, very quickly, due to the speed, which we're going to talk about, and due to the capabilities of S21, what we found were police forces were buying many more licenses than we believed they needed. And when we actually engaged with them on that, they said, we're not just using this for CSE. We have an issue with any type of image and video that being able to process it at speed and at accuracy level and report on it, it just doesn't exist. It's just not really there. So they've deployed, and I say they, police forces have deployed S21 in so many different crime varieties, including human trafficking, counter-terrorism and gang violence, and of course, major crimes, including things like murder. So having loads of CCTV and being able to very quickly look to say, okay, we're looking for any frames that contain a car, which again, we'll talk about the AI, or we're looking for, you know, we've got this doorway. When does anyone walk through that doorway? Counter-terrorism, we're looking for knives, we're looking for, you know, serial numbers of guns. And if we find a serial number, can we search across all the other images that we have to try and find that serial number? These are just a few of the ways in which they've took S21 and Laser Eye outside of CSE. Of course, our primary clientele is still working in the CSE arena and combating CSE. But of course, there's all these different crime types as well. And there's a little screenshot there of how the application looks. Running through a basic case would be a bit boring, so we're hoping the content we're going to provide is a bit more useful. But please do check our website for more screenshots, etc. So I want to start with quite a generic question of what's in a picture. You know, we all have thousands of pictures on our phones, computers, hopefully all legally held. But we all have all these fantastic, memories. They really do capture moments. But what is actually in a picture? So for us, we can quickly go through our phones and we can see, pictures of, our loved ones, our family, memories, holidays, pre-COVID, when we could actually go out and meet with people and have a few pints down the pub, etc. All these wonderful memories there. Or if you're really old, remembering when United could win a game and hold on to a lead. But still. Whereas now, when an investigator looks at a picture, it's not as cut and dry. It's not just about the focus of the image. There's so much more that an investigator needs to look into. And one of the challenges and burdens Claude's already talked about is the time they have to do that. And also the human. They're going to get tired. They're going to miss things. And that's really where AI really kicks in. So let's take this image. What's inside this image? We could quickly say, well, you've got a lady who's got a phone on the bed, etc. And that's it. But we can't be so cut and dry in forensics. Let's take that same image and let's look at that, how an investigator looks at it. And this really talks about how S21 looks at an image. So straight away, we can take any image. And again, we're not limited to these options, but we're looking at how many people are, or how many persons are inside that image. Is there a face detectable? If there is a face detectable, for instance, can we work out the age of the person, the gender, the ethnicity, or the emotion? And the emotion can be very, very strong to tell you about what's been depicted there, whether there is potentially, something harmful, something distressing being depicted based upon the face of the person showing. The clothing being worn, is there a normal amount of clothing being worn? Is there limited clothing like down at a beach, a bikini, for instance, or is someone naked? And of course, even whether there's clothing or not, are we able to discriminate between whether there's what we call private parts or genitalia being depicted? The focus of the image is important as well. Is it focused on a private part? Is it an overall picture? Is it focused on a background and it's just caught something unnecessary? These are all challenges and all, things that an investigator has to consider. The filters being applied, this can help us discriminate between whether an image is a professionally taken image by, a reputable image house or whether it's homemade. And amateur versus professional is something certainly becoming more of an issue. What objects are inside that image? So again, we're coming out of CSE, but again, we could still be within it. Are there sexual objects in there? Or when we talk about objects, could there be, for instance, any kind of drug paraphernalia in there? So when S21 has been used for gang violence and street violence, etc., could there be cash in the image that could show a potential deal? Various other different things are really, really important within the image. And if you imagine there, how many different images, objects there are that could be used for various different crime types. There's so much an investigator needs to take on board. We look at where the image is taken. Of course, here it looks like a bed, maybe a bedroom. You can try and discriminate from that. But an investigator needs to think this through, on the likeliness of an image being potentially of useful content to their investigation based on where it's been taken as well. Not just GPS, which we'll talk about later, but the actual room it's taken in. The colors and patterns that are within the room, and we'll use some of these examples. Something I learned from one of our new member of the team who's an ex-sergeant is I didn't realize all the carpets in Wetherspoons in the UK, if anyone can think back to when we were last in Wetherspoons, all the carpets in a Wetherspoon are apparently custom made for a Wetherspoons. And they've had investigations before when they've seen an image and a pattern of a carpet and being able to work out which Wetherspoons that was actually in. So there's a useful bit of knowledge if you get to Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And also the special traits that are within a picture. And this is something that really took me by surprise. We work with some fantastic people. And two examples I want to give here is an image. And they were trying to work out, where the image was taken in terms of, the region it was taken in, the country it was taken in. Now, there's no GPS behind it. There was no, identifiable marks. There's not like a flag hanging on the wall or anything like that. And two of the big things that got pulled up out of these sample images, and I'll always remember them, the Coke bottle labels. So Coca-Cola, for instance, the actual labeling around a Coca-Cola bottle is custom designed for each country that it's within. So by being able to look at the background image of a Coke bottle in the back of the room, they were able to actually work out that the Coke bottle was from a different country, and that gave them an idea of which country potentially that picture was taken in, to be able to then contact Europol or contact international organizations to try and get more help. It's only a start, but it's a really good one. And another one, again, took me by surprise, the plugs in the room. And these are simple things that, you know, I didn't think about, investigators may not think about, but AI can. The plug that's in the room, can you imagine when you've gone on holiday, the European plugs and the plugs from across the world versus the UK plugs? Being able to identify the plug, the 3-prong plug in the UK, can show that that picture was potentially taken in the UK, whereas the 2-digit European plug, for instance, could show that it was taken inside of Europe. These are things that, again, the investigator won't necessarily have time to do. They can't always zoom in on images, but AI is going to allow us to do. And of course, the EXIF behind the image, the device model, the serial, the GPS, you know, our phones catalog unbelievable amounts of EXIF. It can even tell us, for instance, you know, the distance above sea level, and also things, for instance, like the actual directionality in which we were facing, times, name, copyright, and so much more. So when we talk about what's inside an image, there's an awful lot inside of it. So what Claude and I have done with the team is we've built what we call the S21 AI engine. And that engine has so many different fantastic AI built in-house by in-house developers. We're not relying on third-party technology. We brought a fantastic team in here, which is growing. And we brought in all these fantastic ways of building this stuff. So we've got everything from facial analysis and age, emotion, nudity. So an investigator to bring stuff into S21, and Claude mentioned speed. To give you an idea, S21's able, well, the average competitor around, well, there's only one really around, can bring in about 1,000 images if they're lucky, much less in videos per minute into their product if it's really suited, customized, etc. Whereas S21's pushing more than 800,000 images and videos per minute ready to categorize. So that's 800 times quicker. That means being able to find the victim quicker, being able to have a holding charge quicker to stop them being put back out, the offender being put back out in public. But also, again, spin that round, being able to help, you know, show someone is actually innocent. And that's really, really important. No more end-of-day process or anything like that. So the AI engine is phenomenally advanced, and we are going to jump into another part. And they've filtered into our 3 products just quickly to mention. So if anyone's been on our website, you'll know these. We've got Laser IT Triage, Laser X, which is our flagship product for image and video categorization and victim ID, and Laser IC, which is purposely built for CCTV. Because again, one of the challenges we've got is the right tool for the right job. You know, giving someone a tool that's got hundreds of different features is overwhelming. They're not going to engage, and that's something that's really, really important. Something I've learned quite early on with S21. You can give someone that can do everything under the sun, but they're not going to use it. And that's because they don't like change and because it's too complex for them, as well as all the other challenges we talked about in terms of training budgets, etc. It's just not worth it. So having purposely driven tools, so Laser IT for triage, being able to go into into a suspect's house, plug in a USB stick, and we can go and find CSAM imagery or CSE imagery on their machine. Or if it's used for counter-terrorism, we can find counter-terrorism imagery. It's phenomenal because it allows investigators to go in with a handful of USBs, plug it into every laptop, every computer in the house or tablet in the house, and we can help find that content if it's relevant. Of course, X being able to do much more than that, the whole package, the report and everything, and C really being able to say, okay, we've got loads of CCTV footage, shot footage, you know, etc. And being able to say, okay, you know, have we got vehicles, have we got persons, have we got number plates, AMPRs built into it as well. So some really cool tools. And the 3 smaller tools on there, Claude mentioned one of them, Corrupt Handler. One thing that, again, really important and a big challenge and something to consider if you're ever in this field or similar fields is not everyone can make the switch, you know, and you may have forces that are licensed with another product and they haven't got the money to switch over, of course. They'll try and do it when their renewal comes. But you can't let those go without. It's not their fault that they're licensed with another product. They still want to do the best job they can. So we've created smaller products now that can supplement other products like the Corrupt Handler, being able to export out what was shown as corrupt or unviewable by one product, drop into our corrupt handler, and that was where, again, we found all those victim images, and it makes a massive difference. So definitely some advice there on the development front. And Enhance, we've done some fantastic stuff, being able to recolorize images, de-blur images for fast-moving imagery, and lots more. Now I'm going to pass you over quickly to AutoCAD, and I'll be back with you shortly to talk about the customer stories. Thanks, Claude.
All right, thank you very much, Liam. Yes, so Liam has sort of given you an overview of the various tools and so on. And today's talk is about AI. So there's one particular one, and I mentioned earlier on about this business of grading or categorizing images. And I also said that typically you have an investigator sitting there and then watching those images and videos, and for each one of them deciding what severity grade to allocate, and that the process itself, one, takes a long time, number two, error prone, and obviously there's a mental health issue there as well, which is where the automation comes in, where in this particular case, we've come up with an AI-based system to do the categorization automatically. I'll tell you very briefly what the key things are about it. Yeah, could I go to the next slide, please, Liam? Yeah. So essentially, we've come up with a solution where we've looked carefully at, we talk in categorizing images, but in this particular case, we want to help the investigator do their work as fast as possible. Yeah. Which means you've got to think about what exactly that you're trying to do. You're not trying to replace the investigator. You want the investigator to find the relevant information quickly without losing important information. That's key. Yeah. So we've come up with a way of essentially getting the AI sift through images very quickly. We talk in images and videos, and then deciding whether they should go into the child sexual abuse material, CSAM, or child pornography bin, or it will go into the child other box, or it's going to be said, this is legally held, or it's adult pornography. So this way, the investigator is able to just very quickly say, oh yes, I want to start by just looking at the ones that have been labeled or potentially said to be child pornography. Yeah. And in many cases, you'll find that, there's quite, okay, depending on the case, but some cases it could be that they're just a few child pornography images, and then the rest are either legally held or adult pornography, in which case they pass it on to another department. Needless to say, by just doing this, where you're able to place things in different boxes and then let the investigator go and take a closer look into those boxes, as long as, like I said earlier on, you're accurate enough in terms of allocating the files, images, and videos into the relevant boxes, then that's really, really going to speed up their work tremendously. Yeah. And we launched the S21AC towards the end of last year, and already we've sort of, been getting feedback where essentially people are very happy with the high accuracy they've been able to achieve. Yeah. And also one of the things that we did is to pay very close attention to the operational environment. Yeah. We know that, AI is power hungry. So typically it's going to need quite heavy hardware. But do all the police forces have very heavy hardware? We try to design it in such a way that even with the normal piece of hardware, they should be able to run the AI. So we're talking no additional hardware required other than the usual digital forensics workstation, high accuracy. And with that, we've been able to hit about 900,000 images in 80 minutes. So we talk in 10,000 images per minute. What this basically means, we talked about the terabytes of data that I mentioned earlier on. It basically means that in a minute, when you're loading those 10 terabytes of images, loading them very fast, and then that can be passed to the AI. And in a minute, you already have the images sifted into the 4 categories that I mentioned earlier on, about 10,000 of them. Yeah, and of course, that means the investigator can get going without having to call it an end-of-day job. So we're talking high speed, high accuracy, no need for special or additional hardware. Obviously, if you've got it, yes, use it by all means. But we're looking at wherever they probably wouldn't be able to do that. Some of the issues with AI is how do you train it? How do you engineer it? And in the particular case, we talk in a data-driven approach. Now, it's illegal for non-law enforcement people to look at child sexual abuse imagery, including us in the commercial sector, which means we had to work with law enforcement. In this particular case, we're very proud to have worked with law enforcement across the 5 ICE nations. So we're talking USA, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and so on. Yeah. The idea was we wanted to cover as wide a range of data as possible, yeah, in order to make the data as representative as possible of what's going to be seen in the world out there. Also very important was, to make sure that the data covers as a representative a set as possible, and also taking care of, trying to avoid bias that could be built into the data in terms of bias against particular social demographics, maybe according to race or anything else. So trying to hit the balance there. And obviously, if you go through 5 different nations, law enforcement across there, you end up with very, very good data set. And of course, this keeps being updated as we keep working. So one thing we're very proud of is the work across the 5 ICE nations. Next, please, Liam. Yeah. So one of the things I mentioned there is the planning, the design, and AI, like anything else, although they say it's intelligent, but it's not intelligent on its own right. That has got to be thought when you are either collecting the data or the actual system that you're going to use, the particular algorithms you're going to deploy, and also how you're going to use them in the field. Yeah. So for us, the core things that we're looking at is we want high autonomy as possible, but as well as high accuracy. Yeah. We mentioned the backlog, a year to a year and a half. Again, we want to reduce the time they spend labeling those images so that, they could find the relevant images faster, and very importantly as well, be pinpointed towards victims faster as well. Mental well-being is another recurring theme. And again, with the help of the automated system, we were able to try to protect the investigators as best as possible. And as well as we've got some solutions in the background that keep monitoring what they watch and giving advice as to when they should take a break or not. So we're taking the management side of things. So in a nutshell, we wanted something that's reliable, practical, easy to use, and cost effective. And in this particular case, we're not charging for the auto categorizer. We're just giving it for free, provided you're already one of our customers. We just bundle it into our tools. And again, for us, it's very important because at the beginning, when the talk was being introduced, one of the things about British Computer Society membership is the members. You go to work for public good. We're talking public interest. And for us, that was one of the ways of doing that. So in a nutshell, no extra hardware, no extra fees, and no complexity. Yeah. And again, just to quickly give you an idea of sort of feedback that we've received so far, worldwide, we're talking the USA, the UK, Canada as well, and so on. Again, there's praise for the accuracy, praise for the speed, the automation, and so on. Well received. And again, it goes back again to, you got to sit down, design the system, plan it, and think about how it's going to be deployed for under operational conditions. Next slide, please, Liam. All right. So we talked about the auto categorization. Yeah. And again, earlier on as well, I mentioned the fact that for legal admissibility, a human being have got to be kept in the loop, which is where we're looking as well at assisting the investigator. We mentioned victim identification as being very important. Again, we've done some semi-automated AI to assist the investigators with the victim identification task. Yeah. In other words, again, we talked about the terabytes of data and so on, rather than them, sitting down, deciding what to do and so on, launch the victim assisted vid system, and then it's able to pick up the relevant bits and then presents it to you to say, you've got to start looking at this and that, because potentially there could be victims here, or this is where you might find some additional clues, essentially some nice and clever stuff. We talked again about the categorization at length, takes a long time to grade and so on. There as well, we've come up with some semi-automated solution as well for assisted categorization. So we're looking at automation with auto categorization, and we're also bringing in assisted categorization and victim identification tools as well. I think this is a good point for me to highlight the reason why we called our company Semantics 21. One of the ambitions that we had was we got all these images, videos, and so on. Yeah, what the investigator really needs is to get the meanings, of the evidence, of the facts containing that evidence, rather than just, well, here's an image, it's grade A, grade B, and so on. After all, investigation is a very, very clever thing. You need intelligence. You need to look at the various bits, connect the dots, and so on, pick up the relevant clues. So for us, the ambition was to extract as much meanings, understanding from the evidence presented, and hence the word semantics. And again, we wanted that so that we can take law enforcement into the 21st century. And there is a 21 for you. So that's roughly the story behind why we called it Semantics 21. Next, please. So Liam now will tell you some stories about the customers that we worked with, and we'll probably hand back again to the outstanding challenges. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks, Claude. I know we're running on time a little bit, so I'll push through my bit a little bit quicker on this. So really, I want to give you some examples of actual case studies here that have been done and cases that have been done with S21, just to really kind of like give you an idea of how AI has been deployed, and hopefully inspire and hopefully, get people thinking about how other AIs that could be used for so many different things could be deployed into this field and similar fields that could really make a massive impact. It's really about thinking outside the box. There's a few examples on our website. I'm just going to really mention 3 of them quite quickly without going into too much detail. So if you want to read more about these, please check out our customer stories on our website. They're all live stories, all real world stories. They're not being fabricated. So a police force that we work with had a case where they had huge amounts of images in. Of course, that's not really anything that's new. However, they knew that they had a victim that had come forward, and they believed that that victim said that there were pictures, etc., that had been taken of them. Now, if you imagine being an investigator loading this in and having millions of images, where do you start? It's very, very difficult. Now, quite cleverly, what S21 has built in, and certainly what the investigator deployed really, was they thought, well, okay, what is unique about what the victim statement said? And one of the unique parts about the victim statement was the fact that there was a pink nighty involved, that the actual victim had a pink nighty on. So going from a million images, what the investigator was able to do is very quickly in S21, choose our color picker. Very, very simple option. You click it and it says, what kind of color do you want? Now they had 2 options here. They could have just chosen a color or multiple colors, or they could have actually used a sample image. Of course, they had that nighty, so the investigator loaded the nighty in as a reference image, pipetted the pink on the nighty because it was quite a shimmery kind of pink color from what it's described. And instantly, S21 was able to go through all of the image colors and was able to pull out colors that had that color pink with a amount of buffer threshold. So not exactly that, but of course, kind of compensate for lighting and shadowing, which is part of the issue. By doing that, the investigator took down thousands and thousands of images down to a few hundred, and almost instantly that image, or that 90, was being depicted on screen. By doing that, what the user was able to do then was go through a much smaller amount of images to begin with. Of course, we're not saying don't go through everything, but go through a smaller amount of images to begin with. And that revealed not only the victim, but multiple victims, but on top of that, showed a very, very clear face of the perpetrator. Now, using that clear face of the perpetrator, they were able to then put what they called a holding charge on to stop them from being released out on bail. Now, without S21 and without that investigator's, expertise and insight there, what would have happened is it would have been held maybe for a number of months. Then it would have been loaded up, an end-of-day process, and then it had been going through. That perpetrator could have reoffended. the victim potentially would not have been found, or on top of that, of course, you know, they could have absconded. They could have, you know, disappeared. So a very, very quick way of using AI to look at colors, and that's also been used for gang violence and graffiti. So a lot of graffiti leads back to other channels, which it can include CSE as well. So working with various forces that are investigating crowd and gang graffiti, they're able to look at colors that are the predominant graffiti color to try and find those other colors around. Just a quick way of using AI for color. Another example of a victim that was tied up with a rope. Now, to try and go through thousands of images of you know, hundreds of thousands of images takes huge amounts of time. They needed to know potentially, okay, who actually tied the rope? Where was the rope used in these images? Where's the rope in any of these images? And which victims were tied up with ropes as well? That was very, very important. Try and go through everything was just unbelievable. However, we built in something called key point matching, and what the investigator was able to do was to take a picture of the sample rope, or take a picture of a rope off the internet. It didn't have to be the exact one. And with S21, they highlighted the rope, just drew around it, very, very simple. S21's AI then looked into the pattern recognition of that rope to try and work out the patterns that were around it. It then searched through all of the rest of their case, and it brought back any hits, and it ordered them by the amount of hits, i.e. the amount of similarity between the rope pattern that was drawn around and other ropes. And again, this was a case that only had about 200, 300,000 images in it, but that's still a lot. I say only, that's quite small for a digital forensics case. But that investigator was able to bring back about 60 or so images of that rope, but in various scenes as well, from just being on a bedside table to being tied around multiple victims, different victims they did not know about. But again, that investigator was then able to highlight victims and local abuse victims, people the offender had contact with, to make sure they got help. These victims had not come forward. If it wasn't for the investigator taking that, you know, extra step to look for it, they wouldn't have been found potentially, or not come forward. But also, again, the perpetrator tying the rope. And again, there's no stronger evidence of being able to go to court and show that actual suspect tying the rope around a victim. It's very, very powerful. And also for court charges, you're going to get the best charges if you can give that kind of evidence. Leave nothing to question. One more, again, many of us may have iPhones. A case only about a year ago, we had a very, very interesting case in America where they had a court case ongoing. And what they were able to prove is that, or what they were trying to prove was that a offender had assaulted someone. They could prove that the offender knew the assaultee and vice versa. So the offender knew the victim, etc., and vice versa. They then were able to get the images, and they could prove that, like with the iPhone, it records IMG, I don't know, 101, and then 102, then 103, etc., in a linear pattern. They could prove that, but it wasn't unique. They argued, the defense argued, that could happen on any phone. They looked at the time and date, and there was about a 2 hour, I think it's about 2 hour, 12-minute difference between them, and they couldn't prove that. Now, they had an image taken by the just what they believed was the suspect, but they couldn't prove it live on his phone. And they're trying to work out, how can we prove it's live on his phone to place him at that crime scene? They tried all these different options. Even the model and the EXIF data behind the iPhone shows that it was an iPhone, but didn't give the serial number because Apple did not embed the serial number of a phone behind the images, which is a problem. So they came to us and said, you know, what can your team do? And we did some analysis on both the suspect image with them. Of course, we didn't have the image, but the suspect image and one of the images on their phone. And using the AI and the pattern recognition, S21 was able to recognize, mainly through EXIF, that we found what we call the power on runtime. We could find how long the iPhone was actually turned on for, which meant that we also proved in court that the suspect image, the illegal image, which we believe came from the suspect phone, but they deleted and got rid of, and another image they took from 2 hours earlier in the night in a pizza joint, we were able to prove that both of those images, the runtime power on was in parallel, which meant that whoever took the pizza image, or the picture in the pizza bar, would have had to have turned their phone on at the same nanosecond in time as the one that took the illegal image, which the police had. And that was enough then to get a guilty plea, and they actually rolled over and said, yeah, okay, we took it for a lesser sentence. Really important to think, again, outside the box. And Claude's mentioned before already, I won't go back into it, one of the examples, again, an American cop, where they had a small video, they couldn't identify victim or offender, put it through our corrupt handler, and we're able to pull out corrupt frames. And we're really proud of the work we're doing with anti-corruption system to try and actually pull those frames out. So, and that's just a few of them. Please do check out our website. So in terms of the outstanding challenges, they're actually there. And Claude, just jump in when you want. But in terms of the outstanding challenges, there's a number here which still remain. And starting from where I started earlier today, these still exist. And although we're tackling them as much as possible, it's still important that everyone else in the field, new developers, new designers, new research, and hopefully some of the people on the call can try and chip away at these burdens as well. First of all, we've got the continual cat versus mouse game, keeping up with new technologies. For instance, virtual reality, we've mentioned before, imagine, the kind of media we're talking about in VR makes things even more difficult. Of course, the new capabilities are out there. We talked about not just, the new hardware that's out there and the free availability of that hardware, but the actual anti-forensic techniques are out there. There are a lot more people now where this whole shout about, we think about 2 years ago, the Apple issue of not unlocking the iPhone. Where does privacy end or privacy start and anti-forensic start and anti-forensics end? Were Apple stopping police from being able to investigate? It's a very, very difficult subject, not one going to be easily discussed here, but anti-forensic techniques are causing a problem to really stop forensics from being able to do their job. The legal challenges. Now, there's some big cases out there that AI and embedded AI is becoming under scrutiny on in terms of the fairness. Is it picking on one ethnicity more than another? They're very, very difficult challenges that are coming in. Now, forces are trying to deploy AI to try and keep on top and try and tread water on the difficulty of going through so much. So it becomes very difficult. It becomes a very big balancing act. The operational challenges such as automation. Now, the big danger there, of course, we need to do things more, but we're talking about de-skilling the workforce. And if you've got something that's de-skilling the workforce, on that time you actually need that inspiration, you have that problematic case, it's becoming an issue. The lack of semantic intuitiveness, being able to look at an image of a child partially naked, for instance, in a bath. Many families may have a photo of a loved one, etc., at a young age. That doesn't make it a CD image, whereas to an AI, that's just going to see it as a partially naked child. Having that semantic intuitiveness, having that investigator look and verify something, can put into context what's actually there, is something that's hugely forgotten about. So the intuitiveness is very, very important between what is a standard family photo and dismissible versus what is deemed as something more serious. And Claude mentioned as well the speed and the computational power. AI is power hungry. It wants big processors, it wants great GPUs. And of course, the more we want to process and the amount we want to process, again, becomes very, very time-taking and computationally powerful and expensive. I think the other thing that's really, really important to drive home is the myth around AI. There are too many companies and too many individuals that are throwing the AI word around. We know companies that call AI simple date and time lookup. That's not AI, that's filtering data. We can do that in Excel. It's very, very difficult, but what it does is it causes a mistrust between people deploying the AI and the people, making the AI. We've had it before when Estrion was started. People told us there's no such thing as nudity detection. Of course, there's such a thing as nudity detection. You can develop it. You can look at shapes, body outlines, genitalia. You've got all this fantastic deep learning technologies as well that can actually help build, if you do it correctly and plan it well and have a very, very good data set and training set, as Claude mentioned, you can build something that can give you true representation. Now, years ago, there were companies bashing around nudity detection, which was simple color lookup. And they were just looking at the average skin color of a person and using that for nudity. And that's not only, of course, biased, it's also incorrect. It's going to give you a lot of false positives. What that does is it creates a problem that when we go in and say, here's nudity detection, now we tried it before, it doesn't work. Well, you've not tried ours, and what you were being sold is snake oil. You've been sold something that, was being marked up by marketing, essentially. So unrealistic expectations as well. Nothing's going to be 100%. We've seen people say, we can do this in 98%, 99% effective. But then you look into the small print, that's only a very, very small subset with confidence and thresholds very high. And again, it's all about the marketing. And what you've got there is very, very unrealistic expectations. And when people have been let down by the blurb that others have come out with, makes it very, very difficult. And it is a massive challenge. And there's no real regulation in this field for what you can actually, say. And that's why we're very open and transparent about how our testing is done. And that's very, very important. The ethical privacy and other concerns, is AI, trustworthy? There's a huge controversy. You can have a look on the internet around something called Clearview AI. And what they essentially were doing is they built a web crawler to look at images over Facebook, for instance, and social media. And then what they're able to do is say, give us an image of a suspect or a victim, and we'll scour the internet and try and find you the best matches. Now, where's your privacy there? They're going into your Facebook accounts. They're going into, your personal photos. You potentially could get a knock at the door from a police officer saying, "Oh, we think you match, some of the traits of, our suspect we're looking for." You have nothing to do with it. You may be in a different country, but this is the problem around the trustworthiness and, of course, the recognition and how much we rely on it and what we call predictive policing, which is something definitely to look up. The data-trained AI, of course, has a bias, and I can see there was a message in the question, which we'll come to very shortly, in terms of, is there a bias in the training data? Are we training on a particular gender, a particular age, particular ethnicity? Now, these are things that really the question get answered by how good the actual research and development team are behind it. It's very, very important to have very good people who can consider these factors, and it's definitely something that needs to be planned very early on. And that's why having expertise such as Professor Chibelushi on this team makes sure that our development team keeps that high level of standard and that high transparency. And we're very transparent with courts about the way in which we train our AI. And that's important as well. But it's still a challenge because, of course, not everyone lives up and has the expertise that we're fortunate to have here. And of course, the public concerns around the technological singularity in terms of, what it can actually do, etc. So these are really things to really consider. And I think there's one big thing to shout out here, really, and that's AI is not a magic wand. To get AI to perform effectively and unbiased, and of course, efficiently, you need to have huge amounts of planning, careful design, and of course, the expertise behind it. And we're very, very lucky here in S21 to be able to have a fantastic team, and credit to the team that are listening in currently. And of course, Claude that runs that side of the team. But also to work with fantastic partners around the world. And really one of the things that makes us very, very unique, well, we can't be very unique. There's an argument for someone who may be listening. Well, something that makes us unique here is we work with police forces on the actual data. So we're not using sample data, controlled data, and testing across it, which gives us a bias, which gives us unrealistic expectations. We work with people who have the actual media, real life data, and also that do a lot of work in terms of creating training data sets for us. Now, of course, they're not providing that information. We provide them with the ability to train, and we work with the Five Eyes Nations to do that. But by having these fantastic people on board who are subject matter experts that have a huge amount of data that's very, very high quality, and different ranges of that data as well, means that our AI can really stand up to the challenge of real life. It's not a controlled in-house project that we suddenly released in the wild and it just goes really terribly wrong. So we have very, very high standards on everything we release. Should be at least 70+% effective on all investigations it's tried on. If it's not, or it's going to give any kind of issues, of course there's going to be outliers where it's 90% or maybe where it drops a bit low, but it has to be proven that it can be that highly effective. Claude, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to mention on the outstanding challenges there.
No, I think we've covered most of them. Of course, there is some more, and some will take a long time for us to finish them. We're already behind schedule, so yeah, I think you've done a pretty good job. Thank you.
Excellent. And so I think just before we do quickly the Q&A, I don't know if there are any questions coming in. Do please check our website. We do have a number of career opportunities coming up as well in AI. We've just received a substantial amount of funding through a competition at Innovate UK. So thank you very much to them to create an even more powerful victim identification AI like the world's have never seen, building off of the success we've had so far. So if you are interested in that field, please do have a look on our website or get in contact and that. So questions, sorry, to the organisers. Do the organisers have questions, or do I find them somewhere?
Well, thank you guys very much for a very interesting talk. We've got, I think, 7 open questions, really. So, I mean, ideally, if we can try and address those questions either verbally or in the Q&A section, that would be really helpful, guys.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just going in question order, maybe that might be helpful. Rich Gosling had a question. Is there a feedback loop where users are able to flag false positives to improve model accuracy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, there is a system that's allowing us to do that. So all cases in S21 get recorded into what we call our intelligence databases, but it can also flag where we have mistakes in our AI, and we're able to learn from that. Of course, we don't have the images, so essentially those sample sets are provided to one of the SPOCs, single points of contacts, depending on their region and their country. But it means that we can continuously train the AI using expert opinion. So yes, that's a really important part of our system.
Thank you. And Sharon's asked a question. There must be an error rate. If so, do you work with your customers to feed errors back into the modeling of the AI to evolve its accuracy?
Yeah, absolutely. And similar to the question above, continuous, some of the things that cause errors can be things like new filters. So for instance, one we ran into recently, with when Snapchat, for instance, adds a new filter onto their system, we need to help compensate for that. So it's very important we build appropriate representative training sets with that, which obviously can take time, but we've got fantastic people on board in police forces across the world supporting us. So yeah, again, we work with the customers if they find there's errors or certainly patterns within the errors. If they come back and say, hey, someone wearing glasses can affect our age recognition, for instance, they feed that feedback back. They try and then provide a sample of images to, again, the force within their region that's working with S21 on the training. And that force then essentially helps us retrain part of that model.
Great, thank you. Just moving through then. Darren's asked a question. Does Semantics 21 integrate with other digital forensic tools such as FTK and autopsy? If not, can Semantics 21 be used to identify and forensically investigate images attached to emails that have been captured in seized hard drives, for example?
Yeah, really good question. Yes and yes. First of all, one of the things we're really keen to do is to integrate with all providers. So FTK is a fantastic toolkit, access data. So yeah, we have a great relation with them. They do a cracking job as well. And of course, autopsy and sleuthkit. So essentially, you can whichever tool you use, whether it's FTK, Magnet, Cellbrite, Blackbag, X-Ways, Encase, anyone else, we work with all of them to ensure that you can export seamlessly out from their products into S21, because we're one part of a larger jigsaw, and it's important that people can use the right mobile phone tool to work with phones, the right computer tool to use computers, etc. So yeah, we integrate with all of them. And in terms of actual direct hard drives, we can also integrate in hard drives directly. So of course, triage will work on a live system or a booted system or a dead box system. It sounds like they're forensics. I don't know what I mean by that. But on top of that, the Laser IX can plug in EO1, LO1s, DD images, and of course, RAD-blocked hard drives. So we can actually do logical reads and physical reads from them as well. And of course, that would include embedded imagery, as you were referring to by your emails. Yep. Sorry, Charlie, you still there? I think you're on mute.
Sorry, yes, sorry. Thank you for that. Andre's asked a question. What language infrastructure did you use to train the AI?
All right, I can take that, Andre. Yeah. Essentially, I think from our end is what matters most is about the AI itself as opposed to language infrastructure. Of course, language and infrastructure are important when it comes to the operational issues and in particular speed and everything else. But otherwise, the core of our work is about trying to be as language or platform agnostic as possible. So we don't really pay that much attention to it. We look at the particular problem that we're addressing, the sort of data that we're using, and what's the best route to go. Is it using Python or Java or whatever else? All that is part and parcel of the careful design and planning that Liam mentioned earlier on.
Okay, thank you. And Sharon's asked, I think probably quite a big question, but it could be a quite short answer. Should there be some standards around AI?
Oh, it's a cracking question. Yeah, it's a really cracking question. Yes, I strongly believe there should be standards around AI. However, whenever, certainly in the UK, with the greater respect to people working in standardization, whenever we seem to try and apply a standard or standardization around things, we overcomplicate it. And we don't just overcomplicate it, we either make it unusable, or we make it tedious, or we make it just time-staking, and there's no need. I think definitely there should be standardization around AI, because everyone's bashing AI around. Everyone's testing AI differently. Everyone's developing it differently. I do think there should be some level of standardization, but I think we just need to be really careful that we don't alienate AI developers, because everyone should be free to create AI, because that's how some of the best stuff started. And some of my team members started in various fields. So yeah, definitely standardization, but I think it really needs to be cleverly thought out on making sure there's the right balance between standardizing to make it better. That's what standardization should be for, making things better and more transparent without hindering developers. It's a really great question, though.
Yeah, I agree with Liam, and I would add, essentially, we're talking about AI. One of the problems that it suffers from is the distrust from the public in general that Liam sort of hinted to earlier on. So with standards, hopefully, that would sort of try to reassure people about, one, whether something is actually AI or not, because again, I think the bandwagon that Liam mentioned earlier on is an issue, and therefore you get things being called AI that really aren't, and things that are not supposed to work in a certain way, they do, and so on. So the regulation standardization, I think, is going to be an important part of that, provided it doesn't stifle the creativity.
Thank you, guys. Just last few questions now. How frequently, from Rich, how frequently is the training data refreshed to recalibrate the models?
Claude, I don't know if you want to jump in on that. I mean, my answer really there is it's almost as and when. We try and keep them updated as frequently as possible, but when you've got a model that's working very well and certainly to the performance to get to, trying to get that extra few % out of it can be very, very difficult. Certainly when we find there are any reported issues, they're investigated closely and we try and refresh the model to account for it. But we also want to be careful of something called data overfitting to make sure we don't go too far with our AI and either bias it or anything like that. So to answer your question there, we try and do it frequently. But really that depends on our partners as well, being able to create the data sets or enhance the data sets, whether there's a need to do that, and so forth. So it's really a bit of an ad hoc kind of situation.
Yes, and I would add to that as well. I mean, the problem of recalibration is that we're talking about a worldwide issue. Yeah, so you might recalibrate based on the needs of maybe a particular country or countries and so on. Does it really recalibrate without damaging the performance for other parts of the world, for example, or other types of images? So it's just one thing that we approach very carefully. So it's back again to the careful planning, careful design that Liam mentioned earlier on.
Okay, thank you. And somebody's asked an anonymous person who's asked this: how can I start a career in AI as a novice, currently in digital marketing? So a bit more for a beginner, really. How does a beginner start their career in AI?
Well, I think for me, I'll take that. I think it just depends. Okay, first of all, I'm not sure what the background is, essentially your academic background and so on. So obviously, it'll be a case of if you've got the background to cover whatever is being taught. For example, I think some of the AI can be a bit mathsy and so on. Then you can jump at a much higher level. But if you don't have the background, then you probably might need to start lower, with acquiring the foundational skills and then eventually progress onto the actual application. But what's very important for me is to try to avoid to see AI as more or less, I think, a black box, where literally, these days you can find loads of AI on GitHub or wherever, where, just push data through it and you get some outcomes and so on. Most people don't actually understand what's actually going on inside the AI. And hence we go back to the issues that we mentioned earlier on about trust and everything else. So very important, if you want to move into AI, be prepared, to learn the fundamentals and not be afraid of actually wanting to look inside the box. In other words, much more in-depth sort of learning. And with that, I think you probably are going to remain competitive for a number of years, irrespective of which way AI is going to evolve, because then you'll be able to upgrade your skills because you've already got a solid foundation. Solid foundation is going to be key.
Thank you for that, Claude. Carol's asked a question on standards. Are you involved in the IEEE 7000 family of standards development?
Yeah, the IEEE 7000 standards. So we're talking about the automation and ethics. Yeah, we do work alongside, or we do work within the realms of them. We don't have all, we aren't to the level, again, certified for them. It's not something we're required to do. The biggest standard in this field, just for it sounds like someone knows about standardization on here, which is really important, is 17025. So 17025 is currently hitting all our forces in the UK from a year last October. And 17025 is really about standardization of forensics, everything from imaging disks through to its categorization and subjectivity, even, believe it or not, around it. So we're much more in on that side of things, as opposed to the more generic standards for the automation and the ethics. But saying that, Claude, of course, with Claude's background and a number of our researchers' backgrounds here, we're well aware of them and we work within the realms of them and we like to engage with them. They're just not overly applicable in some of the areas we're in. Police forces are more interested in that 17025. So yeah, 17025 definitely a standard to look at in this field. Oh, Charlie, I think you're on mute.
Hello, yeah, sorry. AI can be biased. How do you plan to resolve this in Semantic 21 in terms of data use? So I think this is a question regarding bias, AI bias.
Yeah, of course. Claude, is that something you want to jump in, or jump in?
Yeah, all right. I think Liam discussed this earlier on about, trying to avoid bias, and typically that's embedded in the data. So it goes back again to the careful design, careful planning in terms of strict criteria about what data to use. Yeah. Now, for us, I think one of the biggest issues that we're facing is that it's illegal for us to actually look at that data. And so, in other words, we have to rely on someone else to choose the data and then get it to train our models. But we provide the criteria, in terms of, the balance across the data sets, what sort of details or characteristics that we would like to see in the data set as well. So it's, again, one that's very difficult to avoid, especially if someone else is actually doing, the selection of the images for you. But we are careful about the criteria that we do give them to use.
Yeah,
thank you for that.
I guess just jumping on there, I think it's a very, very difficult one, but it's also something that by working with police forces live makes a massive difference in making sure that bias is as little as possible. But don't forget, we're not making predictions. We're not saying we predict this person's going to go and stab someone, for instance. We're not doing that kind of prediction. What we're doing is we're creating almost clever filters for people to be able to get through the data as efficiently as possible.
Yeah. And again, I think just to add to Liam's answer there about, predicting so that someone goes to actually do. Remember, I talked about the legal admissibility of the evidence. So it's not just a case going to court based on the AI alone. The investigator is required to look at the data. Of course, the filtering allows them to work much faster, but at least there's a backup there in the sense that an investigator ultimately will have to vouch for what the investigation findings are.
Thank you for that, guys. Just a few more if you've got time.
Yeah, of course.
Angela's asked a question. In your experience, how prevalent is the use of stenography to exchange communications images in the criminal world? Steganography.
Yeah, steganography. So hiding stuff, essentially. I used to teach this at Staffordshire University when I was teaching digital forensics as well, so it's good to come back to my roots. It's a good question. It's not really one you can answer because real steganography can't be found. The true extent of steganography is only really revealed if we were able to correctly find it, if that makes sense. But in terms of how often it gets run into, it's really difficult. It's a really, really difficult one. So we work with some fantastic partners across the world that do a lot in terms of the data carving that work with us. And also, of course, we mentioned before, we partner with great people like X-Ways Forensics. They do a cracking job at being able to pick up steganography. Certainly when we talk about ADS, alternative data streaming, if someone's in that world, they'll know what I mean. They can easily pick that the kind of thing, not easily, but they can certainly pick them up to quite good levels in there. How prevalent is it? It's very difficult. I couldn't really say because we do run into it every so often. One of the big things we built in, and it's not really steganography, but it's something to be aware of, is I believe we're one of the only tools in this field where we can take a Photoshop file which has many layers, and without the use of Photoshop, being able to extract out its layers. So if we've got an image which is a PSD and you load into other tools on the field, you'll see the top layer, whereas we can see beyond that and we can extract out the layers, and that's built in. That's really as far as we go with the steganography. So yeah, it's a really difficult question. I'm sure it's out there, but upfront carvers do quite okay with it. But I think the really, really, really good criminals that have sophisticated encryption, steganography, keeping stuff on the cloud, they are going to be difficult to get. A lot of the people which we're capturing day in, day out, I'm sure, are the people who are downloading peer-to-peer and live box systems, file sharing systems online. They're the ones which have been caught. I think the really good ones have probably not always been caught, unfortunately. Not really an answer, but it's probably the best I can give on that.
Yeah, sorry,
it's a
Claude.
cat and mouse game.
Yeah.
And again, this is where the anti-forensics come in as well, trying to find ways of avoiding being caught. So
yeah, definitely a worthwhile field to be looking into. It's just a very, very difficult one. I remember my old teaching days. Okay,
thank you. Nearly there. Just a quick question about gender split in your staffing, and also whether just a view as to whether it's a male-dominated industry at the moment.
So we've got both male and female staff. Although I do admit it's male-dominated, and that's not due to any kind of bias or anything like that. It's right people, right job. But we're always happy to work with both male and female. We don't have any kind of profile in here at S21. Very, very important. It is definitely a male-dominated area in terms of the developers, I guess. We do have some female developers, but in terms of developers, yeah. AI, I think, is more gender neutral. Claude might be able to say a bit more about that, but I think AI, from what I can see, some of the people we work with and the experts we work with, there's definitely more of an even market-ish there. Still maybe a little bit male, but not as much as, say, developers. In terms of actual police forces and investigators, though, there's probably a few more male, but again, there's lots of female investigators, and all of them, whether male or female, are doing a phenomenal job. Certainly when we look at what we call polit teams and more victim ID, they seem to be more female. So I don't know whether it's attention to detail. I don't know in terms of being able to pick up, those, that Coke can we talked about, or whether it's, the real. But from what I've seen in a lot of the UK, a lot of the victim ID officers seem to be female. I don't know if there's a pattern for that or if it's just completely random. Claude, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's one that's difficult. I think in the absence of stats, it's a bit difficult to comment.
Yeah. I think Charlie might be on mute, mate.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think we've got one question just in the chat itself. Stephen asked, are the government investing in AI and geotech? I mean, I guess you mentioned that you've had a support from Innovate UK. So as a yes, in principle, the answer is that must be yes, I guess.
Yes, in fact, I think the government has got one thing they call is the AI and Data Grand Challenge or something. I think it's definitely something that's high on the priority of the UK government as well as other governments worldwide.
That's great, thank you. Well, I think looks like it's fairly clear. We're down to about 42 attendees. So that's about half the people have gone, but we have run a bit over. I just wanted to say a really big thank you to you all, really, for attending. But a big thank you to Claude and Liam for a fascinating insight into amazing technology that's really very much homegrown, really. So a great local story that will hopefully mean that you guys will grow from strength to strength, and come back and tell us how you're getting on in the future, please. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we'd welcome that. Thank you very much for having us, and thank you for everyone who's took the time to listen in. We really appreciate it. And if there's any follow-up questions or anything, please do let us know. We're always happy. And again, Charlie, thank you for organising this, and Ian as well. We greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much from me as well. And again, it's a pleasure and an honour to have presented today. So the questions were very interesting too.
Absolutely.
And Liam spoke as well, just icing on the cake.
Thanks, Claude. Thanks, Liam. Thank you. That's brilliant.
Yeah,
excellent.
Fantastic event. Thank you very much, guys. The recording will be edited and we'll get that available on the branch website.